Welcome back. Now we'll have our second panel, and it'll be introduced by Stella-Luna of the University of Toronto. Stella, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And once again, welcome our next three laureates. And the first speaker is Dr. Sarah Shuker, who is a postdoctoral fellow in political science at the University of Waterloo, where she uses empirical methods to research the security impact of emerging technologies. She is a SSHRC 2020-2022 postdoctoral fellow, along with being the winning beneficiary for the 2019-2020 University of Waterloo Trailblazer Postdoctoral Fellowship. She is also the founder of Glassbox, a social impact firm that trains stakeholders to identify how social values are translated into AI systems. Her work on the social impact of AI is highly requested by government policymakers. Her Glassbox work garnered an invitation from Her Excellency, the Right Honorable General Julie Payette, to participate in scientific diplomacy as member of the delegation to Lithuania and Estonia. Sarah is also a member of the Government of Canada's Advisory Council on Artificial Intelligence. As a member of the Public Awareness Working Group, she was recently commissioned by Global Affairs Canada to conduct research on gender mainstreaming, Canada's cybersecurity strategy. The working paper was published on the United Nations portal for the open-ended working group on digital ICTs in the context of international security. Her book, Military Age Males in the U.S. Counterinsurgency and Drone Warfare, was recently published with Palgrave Macmillan. You can follow her on Twitter at Sarah Shuker. Our second guest speaker is Donna Dupont, who is a founder and chief strategist in foresight and design for Purple Compass. Donna brings skills and insights developed over 20 years working with leaders in healthcare, emergency management, military, public policy, and strategic planning. She has facilitated a range of foresight and design activities for the Canadian Forces College and the Canadian Armed Forces to address real-world complex challenges. Donna's interests are at the intersection between climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainability. Her aim is to use strategic foresight and design methodologies to address environmental security threats, public safety, civil defense protection, and support force protection in future operating environments. Prior to Purple Compass, Donna held a variety of senior roles within Ontario's Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care in both healthcare and emergency management. She is a recipient of several government awards at the provincial and federal level for outstanding achievement, excellence, and partner relations in policy and strategic planning. Donna completed her Master of Design in Strategic Foresight and Innovation in 2020 from OCAD University, Bachelor of Health Administration in Health Services Management from Ryerson University in 2005, and continuing education with the Harvard Humanitarian Academy. She is a member of the Association of Professional Futurists, International Association of Emergency Managers, Canadian Risk and Hazards Network, and advisory editorial board member for the newly launched Canadian Journal of Emergency Management. And our last speaker, Marek Szeles, who graduated with a Master of Engineering in Innovation and Artificial Intelligence from Czech Technical University, and is currently a technology policy scholar at the University of Cambridge. In his previous work, he advised to military and defense organizations as technology consultant, and he has contributed to open source military projects as a developer, most notably Mill Graphics Library. So without further ado, I now turn over to Sarah, and the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put up my presentation, and I think that went as seamless as one can hope for. Thanks so much to your introduction and also to the panelists earlier today. I've certainly been learning a lot, and I look forward to my co-panelists who will be coming after me. So like Stella mentioned, I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Waterloo, where I study the international security implications of emerging technologies. And I have a specific interest in algorithmic decision-making within military environments. I became interested in data science completely by accident, but as someone who studies civilian protection, it's impossible to ignore how big data applications reorganize political life for civilians who are caught in violent conflict. And a recent explosion of scholarly work highlights the ways algorithmic-driven classification and prediction can perpetuate bias against marginalized groups of people. And in many cases, it's women's invisibility and underrepresentation in the socio-technical pipeline that make them especially susceptible to algorithmic bias from military AI. For civilian men in conflict zones, they are often on the receiving end of gender stereotypes that erroneously assume their involvement in war based on their gender status. So in contrast to women and girls, men and boys' hypervisibility can result in algorithmic bias that works against them. So my first research interests were in terrorism and insurgency and counterinsurgency. However, as soon as you start to study irregular war, urban warfare, you realize pretty quickly that you're going to be studying what's called intelligence, surveillance, or reconnaissance, or ISR. And that is a research path that leads straight to big data and artificial intelligence. So I want to take you back to 2013, when I was a PhD student who had stumbled across the results of a New York Times investigation, which revealed that military-age males were excluded from the collateral damage count from US drone strikes. Now, I recognize that the term military-age male has caused some consternation because of some poor journalistic reporting. So I want to immediately say that yes, researchers do recognize that the term is not interchangeable with combatant. It is a military identifier that refers to all men and boys aged 16 and over until they hit seniority. And military-age males were treated differently than women and girls, and it's instructive to understand the consequences and the reasons behind that, especially since those lessons tell us a lot about the potential for algorithmic discrimination in military environments. I was intrigued because liberal democracies do claim that they are standard bearers in the conduct of war. So if that was the case, then why was a civilian group being excluded from the collateral damage count, which surely goes against the claim that liberal democracies take due care to protect civilians from the worst impacts of war? It was a puzzle worth solving from my end. And at the time, I didn't realize that this question would lead me towards studying big data applications within military environments and documenting how human subjectivity was integral to either the success or failure of ISR. All right, so that was a bit of an introduction, but I think it's necessary for where we're going from here. So there are two identities during war under international humanitarian law, and that is of the combatant and the non-combatant. And that's the principle of distinction in a nutshell. And in practice, however, this is not often the case. I've heard a lot of people say that military-age males aren't combatants, and therefore the designation doesn't influence the targeting decision. I've heard people say that gender, age, religion, that these things do not influence the targeting decision. This is empirically, demonstrably an incorrect assessment of the targeting cycle. These attributes do influence operators on the ground to the point that we now have US Army publications basically admitting to the fact and trying to guide soldiers away from using these attributes to guide operations. And in case you're wondering what exactly classifies one or would turn someone into a combatant, I think there's about 24 sub-criteria in the Geneva Protocols. And then, of course, a civilian or a non-combatant is defined relationally. So if you don't meet any of those criteria, then you are automatically a non-combatant. It can give you a little bit, it's a little bit more complicated in the case of children. That's basically the principle of distinction in a nutshell. Right. So the US is unfortunately notoriously bad at counting civilian death, and they do systemically undercount. In fact, the last time there was a systematic review of civilian death from airstrikes was in 1992 during the Bosnian War. And some authors claim that drone strikes are so poorly miscounted, that civilian deaths from drone strikes are so poorly miscounted that drone strikes are in fact 35 times more deadly than conventional airstrikes. Other researchers dispute these findings for methodological reasons, but still argue that the precision of drone strikes have been exaggerated. And some researchers go so far as to state that US administrations, presidential administrations, and their case for the relative precision of drones has always relied more on an intuitive appeal or appreciation of the drone's unique capabilities, which is a fixed visual target for the crew, extended loitering times combined with small laser-guided munitions. But this intuitive appeal doesn't always match the statistical evidence that is available. So when I saw that the same narrative was being repeated for autonomy and weapons system, and of course the drone is, the archetypal weapons network that is undergoing AI integration into its network, the idea that autonomous systems will make war more humane, very much the same narrative that was leveraged about drone warfare post 9/11, that it will reduce civilian casualties, then the question became pretty clear from my end as a researcher. Is this accurate? Is this an accurate assessment? Can we expect that autonomy and weapon systems will indeed reduce civilian casualties? And I'm not going to leave you hanging. My response to this was clear. We can't argue that autonomous weapon systems will reduce civilian death if we don't know how to properly identify civilians. If you are chronically miscounting civilians based on biases like gender and religion, then AI is not going to correct that problem for you. Right now at the UN, about 90 member states are arguing about the appropriate level of human control that would be featured in these systems. The idea being that if civilians are misidentified, then that's a problem with the software. The human influence is often in these discussions can be scrubbed from the surveillance, the training set, the optimization parameters that need to be decided when choosing an algorithm. But these are socio-technical systems that we're talking about. And as such, it is often the human influence that can be the problem. I do apologize, but I have to have a slide on definitions, of course. So if you've ever Googled what is an autonomous weapons system, then you might be familiar with the definition on the screen, courtesy of Ploughshares. Why do advocates find autonomy in weapon systems so appealing? So the idea behind any kind of algorithmic decision-making is that it does have the potential to reduce discrimination by forcing decisions onto a more reliable empirical foundation and by formalizing decision-making processes, meaning that individual biases are less likely to affect important assessments. That's the promise anyway. And this formalized rule set is viewed to be somehow more ethical than the human operator. By definition, algorithmic decision-making is always a form of statistical and therefore seemingly rational discrimination. And discrimination in this context doesn't hold the same negative connection as when it's used popularly. For instance, we want to discriminate between civilians and combatants to ensure that we're not intentionally targeting civilians. Indeed, the very point of algorithmic decision-making is to provide a rational basis upon which to distinguish between individuals and to reliably confer to the individual the qualities possessed by those who seem statistically similar. However, when we're talking about algorithmic discrimination or bias, what we're usually saying is that there's a discrepancy between the social norms that value fairness and the statistical output generated from predictive analytics. When we speak of discrimination, we're talking about members who have social categories or identifiers that lead to differential treatment on the basis of attributes like race, ethnicity, religion, and national origin. Less obvious social categories can also be sensitive identifiers, so that can also include parenthood, military service, political party affiliation, socioeconomic status, and involvement with the criminal justice system. So what kind of result would potentially qualify as algorithmic fairness? And this is actually a very contested field in itself. But I would argue, at the very least, people that are similar in terms of non-protected characteristics should receive similar predictions. And secondly, differences in predictions across groups of people can only be as large as justified by their non-protected characteristics. I realize that is a bit of a mouthful, but there you have it. I'm also going to contest Shar's definition here because, like all technological systems that use automated decision-making, autonomous weapon systems do hide a large apparatus of human workers who are responsible for the machine's development. And some scholars have used the term ghost work to describe this kind of labor. The criteria that will inform who is and is not a combatant must first be decided by human subjects, and historically military analysts often used gender and race instead of criteria informed by international human law. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So there are a few quotes here by individuals involved in drone warfare and counterinsurgency that I interviewed myself during the course of my PhD. And you can see here that geography was interpreted through a gendered lens. In military operations, we talk a lot about situational awareness, the idea that technology will allow us to ascend the fog of war. The problem is that we have codified the target, usually people, sometimes buildings, but in this particular case, I'm talking about civilians using criteria outside of international humanitarian law. If the way you interpret your target is biased and then you encode that algorithmically, then the AI is not going to be able to magically correct you. And individuals identified as insurgents by their signatures, right? So signature, when we're talking about the signature strike here, are often not engaging in combat. So signature strikes are often preemptive, where individuals are monitored for behavior that are used to predict the likelihood that they will engage in violence. This is in contrast to just a targeted strike where you know the person's identity beforehand. In the case of the signature strike, you don't necessarily need to know the identity as in the name of the person before you use a signature strike. You do have to, however, determine that they're about to engage in some kind of combat function. But what does it mean to be about to engage in a combat function? How do you actually determine what sorts of behaviors are indicative of or predictive of violence? And as a result, signature strikes can often be preempted under that definition. And what I discovered through my research was that being a group of men outside, simply just being outside in public together, could make you suspicious. And that's how you get funerals and weddings targeted. And then the subsequent apology if women or very young children are present, which is not often the case if only men and adolescent, boys and teenagers are present. Oh, there goes my coffee. My apologies. Nothing spilled. I just hit the mug. We don't need to panic. All right, so slide 6. I've included these examples as well, and you can. I'm not going to read them word for word, but I would encourage you to think of terms like the military age male as a verbal tagging function. That's what they're actually designed to do. And essentially they function as a social sorting device, as a type of verbal surveillance technology that tells us how to orient our gaze, who counts as suspicious, and lends us the language to identify risky bodies. Great. So practically speaking, if you're a member of the drone crew, you're an image, video, geospatial analyst, let's say, you're supposed to scan the footage transmitted from the drone's view of the battlefield, and then you're instructed to make sense of the battlefield or the human terrain. And I mentioned that I was interested, or I mentioned that we're connecting all of this to algorithmic bias and how bias can seep into the technical pipeline. Well, this is how it happens. AI that would be involved in the targeting cycle would likely require some kind of classification algorithm. So I'm going to give you one specific example of how bias can creep into an AI system that is linked, that's linked directly to what I'm talking about right now. But first, I'm going to tell you what a classification algorithm is for those of you who might not necessarily have the AI or data science background. So a classification algorithm often uses some form of supervised machine learning where a training set teaches an algorithmic model. The training set functions as a textbook, or you can think of it as a textbook. I'm using an analogy here, of course, that trains that's crafted by human analysts who manually label the input-output relationship data in order to train the algorithm to identify similar relationships during the testing phase and then during real-world application. And the criteria that will inform who is and is not a combatant must first be decided by human subjects. And training data can be one of the first ways of introducing bias into the technical pipeline. And for this reason, the garbage in, garbage out adage has become popular in data science. A supervised machine learning algorithm is really only as good as the training it's fed. And I have stumbled upon papers published, even from US Army Doctrine and Command, where the authors will use, for example, Bayesian modeling, and I'm quoting here, to provide insights into the potential effects of blue force non-kinetic actions on the beliefs, values, and interests of individuals in the civilian population, end quote. So as a first step in this process, the population in the area of interest is partitioned along relevant socio-demographic lines. And in this particular case that I'm quoting here, the authors of the cultural geography model, as they called it, said that the military-age male was somebody who believed that the government owes me, I'm quoting, government owes me a job with honor and power and that violence is acceptable. So that's bad anthropology. And it is also just an example, but it's illustrative because I think we sometimes think of statistics as immune from social life, when the reason we have statistics is to inform evidence-based policy intervention into social life. And maybe I'll also just highlight one other ethical issue here surrounding data collection and the idea that surveillance technologies can actually enhance civilian protection. If you're an AI humanitarian, somebody who believes AI can indeed do good, then what this essentially means is that it frames data collection without the consent of those being monitored in war zones as crucial to the liberal international order. And that introduces ethical tension for those who believe that liberal democratic norms should include respect for data privacy and due process. And I don't think there is any reason to ignore this ethical conundrum that comes from associating democratic norms with increased transnational surveillance of extremely vulnerable communities that are caught in violent conflict. All right. Okay. So this is also why, for what it's worth, I don't really like the killer robots terminology. It really does hide the human labor that is often required to make these technologies function. But the last four United Nations meetings of experts have focused on reinserting meaningful human control into lethal autonomous weapon systems. And the majority of member states have argued that autonomous systems will require a strong degree of human-machine teaming. But the focus on the strike, right, on just the missile component, on the actual killing aspect of autonomous weapons, sometimes obscures how big data applications are used to select human targets in the first place. And the deployment of missiles is but one component in a vast networked bureaucratic enterprise that uses big data to manage foreign populations for the pursuit of military objectives. So I think I'll leave it there. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions and also to drink what remains of my coffee. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for the very informative presentation. And now we move over to Donna. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen. Great, so thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to present at the CDSN Capstone this year. And I also want to thank the Archipelago of Design for the nomination. So my presentation is on shifting paradigms. It's really focusing on leading through complexity, systemic risk, and uncertainty, which is very much what we're experiencing today with the COVID-19 and the pandemic. So this particular presentation is going to just share highlights from my research report as part of my, my thesis from OCAD University, a Strategic Foresight Innovation Program entitled Anticipation in Emergency Management, Shifting from Crisis Response to Shaping Future Resilience. And so this report is available through the OCAD University Open Research Repository, if anyone's interested in downloading the full report that has the complete analysis and summary of findings. So this research project was really want to explore this concept of a need for an evolutionary paradigm shift from managing disasters to managing current and future risks and resilience building in emergency and disaster management. And so these are core targets set by global agendas for 2030. And so this research project really focuses on understanding the current paradigm in emergency and disaster management and how we can support the emerging paradigm of resilience with new mindsets and skill sets moving into the future. So just to give some context, we live in a very dynamic, very complex world. As you can see from this diagram, from the World Economic Forum 2020 report, this is not a linear type of thinking. This is kind of a very complex system where there's a lot of interdependencies and feedback loops. And so it's very challenging to make sense of this from a risk perspective. And so this is kind of the environment that we find ourselves into in these days. And with an increasing frequency and intensity of emergencies and disasters, it's really creating this need to respond to emergencies and threats, and with very little opportunity for recovery before the next emergency presents itself. And so this long-term pattern creates challenges in terms of being able to maintain sustainability moving into the future. So this project, this is just a very summary, quick snapshot of my methodology, but it was a research project that surveyed 33 participants that work in emergency disaster management and military operations, specifically in a disaster context. And this research was collected during May and June of 2020 during wave 1 of the pandemic. So many of the participants in this research study were responding to COVID-19. And the demographics include 2/3 from Canada, 1/3 internationally, almost a 50-50 balance between male and female, with over 70% of participants with a significant amount of experience in the field and across a range of sectors in emergency and disaster management and different focus areas. So the data collected from this study was coded in a variety of different ways. One method was in vivo coding to really understand the emergency management perspective and experience and to elevate the voice of the profession. Another method was versus coding that really helped to highlight some of the conflicts within the system and was very valuable to maps. Additional coding methods such as values coding and narrative coding was used to help explore the internal cognitive side of the paradigm and to understand some of those perspectives. So in terms of the current paradigm in emergency and disaster management, this slide just kind of shows a summary of some of the findings. So the paradigm really follows this methodology in futures called causal layered analysis, which looks at a paradigm across 4 dimensions. The first 2 are really the external part of the paradigm, which looks at the litany or the problems on the surface, the acute issues that we see, the emergencies that need to be resolved very quickly. And then underneath that are the systems and the structures that are currently in place to support this response. And then the bottom two elements really focus on the internal aspects of the paradigm, specifically the mental model worldview and how we understand, how we understand risk, how we understand, our role within the paradigm, and then the narrative at the deepest level, which really identifies and highlights the identity of those working in emergency and disaster management. So as you can see from this, the internal aspect is just as important, that cognitive side of a paradigm, because it is that cognitive, it's that deep narrative and perspective and worldview that drives the structures and rules within the system. So this analysis really looked at both sides, the external and the internal. In terms of some of the anomalies that we saw within the external part of this system, there were 4 archetypal patterns that were revealed as part of our analysis of the different conflicts. And it's important to understand these types of anomalies within a paradigm because they do foreshadow opportunities to kind of move outside of these potential system gridlocks and to be able to evolve the structure towards the new paradigm. So just a quick summary of some of these archetypal patterns includes shifting the burden, which really speaks to the litany part of the paradigm and this tension between responding to acute emergencies that that need to be resolved now versus long-term fundamental solutions to address chronic vulnerabilities in the system. The second one, fixes that fails, really speaks to our mental models and how we perceive risk and our methodologies attached to that. And so it does highlight opportunities to evolve the way we look at risk, to take a more holistic and anticipatory approach to risk and to understand and factor that in within our methodology. The third one goes a little bit deeper into the system and looks at growth and underinvestment, specifically within the emergency management institutions and different structures. And this is important because you want to make sure that the growth and the investment of any kind of resource is keeping pace with the broader system and the broader demands that are being placed on the system. So this particular archetype really speaks to some of the challenges of keeping pace with change, especially with climate change as a strong driver, and as well as other types of drivers and emerging issues within the system, and the need for investment. And certainly this can tap into existing emergency management resources and also additional support and mutual aid resources such as the armed forces to be able to boost operations when needed. And this becomes an important point moving into the future, especially when we know that the environment is shifting and there's more demand externally going to be placed on the system. And then at the final last part of the system, we really look at the archetype of tragedy of the commons. And this is looking at the commons from the perspective of communities and cities as the commons for citizens, and really recognizing the evolving environmental risks and landscape, as well as social vulnerability and other types of vulnerability, and saying that those need to be addressed at the fundamental level locally in order to be able to support an emerging paradigm of resiliency. So the importance, again, of understanding these archetypes, and the report goes into a lot more detail in terms of some of these, the details around these archetypes, is to also understand how to move out of these particular challenges within the system and which leverage points to tap into to start to evolve the system structure towards a more resilient model. So we also asked emergency managers, just their basic image of the future. We wanted to understand what they thought given this current landscape and what were their impressions moving into the future. And so they described a narrative of one that was quite turbulent with constant systemic change, sources of instability leading to chaos. And so this type of description of the future really resonates with post-normal times theory. And post-normal times is a theory that is quite relevant for today. It's this in-between period where old orthodoxies are dying, new ones have yet to be born, and we're kind of caught in this world in between where sometimes things do not make sense. And so we are in this period of transition. And so it's quite important that we are able to be able to identify a vision moving into the future, that one is sustainable, regenerative, and be able to take actionable change now to be able to realize that vision moving into the future. So as part of post-normal times, there are different features. There's complexity, there's contradictions that lead to increasing turbulence, and then that turbulence can move into potential areas of chaos. So in order to understand some of the different levels of uncertainty, we explored this with participants. And uncertainty is an important aspect to explore within any system and within a paradigm. In this particular example for this research, we really want to explore some of the different levels of uncertainty that we carry into the future, that if we don't address, become part of our reality and moving into the future. So the first one is what we call the black elephant in the room, which is surface uncertainty. And these are some of the things that perhaps people are uncomfortable to talk about. And they are very important tipping point issues. So many of the uncertainty elements identified in this particular at this particular level really focus around power and control dynamics. They really highlight some of the issues that need to be addressed around disparity in disaster preparedness, recovery and inequalities that exist, systemic racism and the increase of vulnerability attached to that, as well as gender-sensitive approaches, human rights relief issues, and then the colonial legacy patterns that exist within our structures. The next one is the unknown unknowns, which is known as the black swan. And so some may be familiar with this type of unknown type of scenario or image of the future. But what this highlighted for us in this research project was more around unimagined opportunities. So as you can see, there are two different sides to this, this model. We often look at black swans as threats and risks, but in this particular case, a lot of the things that were so outside of our current worldview were things that align with perhaps a vision of future resilience that are just unimagined opportunities and require an opportunity to explore that space and new models of inquiry to think through what that possibility and that vision could look like. And the last one is really the unknown knowns, which is kind of where we're sitting today. And so many of the participants in this study identified a pandemic as an unknown known, like a black jellyfish event, where we know that this exists in the system. These infectious disease risks exist. But what happens with these types of situations is we have rapid escalation that can cause feedback leading to instability. And so for this type of an event that creates a lot of deep uncertainty, there is a need to understand system complexity, cascading risk, and anticipating potential issues that might be downstream. Some issues associated with some of these in order to balance these the system long term. So in order to move towards a transformed paradigm, one needs to really understand some of the anomalies in this existing paradigm and some of the uncertainties that we're carrying with us into the future. And so some of the narratives around a transformed paradigm are identified here, and starting from the bottom of really, moving from kind of a warrior type of approach to more around healing system vulnerability. And so it's really shifting the archetype in a different way, moving from a very masculine to a more maternal that's around stability and control. And then looking at the worldview. And so how does our perspective and worldview shift to become more holistic, more participatory, and being able to really capture things beyond our current emergency management paradigm. This also leads to how do we restructure our systems to really allow for an ecosystem of collaborative partnerships where we're not siloed, where we are able to exchange knowledge and to learn and evolve both in the short and long term. And then really fundamentally, the goal being about balance and harmony moving into the future. And so to be able to do this proactively and inclusively by addressing the chronic system vulnerabilities in the system, thereby improving resilience and agility. So in order to actually shift a paradigm from where we are today towards this transformed paradigm, we need to really address two different dimensions. One is moving from a top-down paternalistic type governance approach to more of a bottom-up participatory governance to empower that at the local level. And then and the next dimension is really looking at it from a cultural standpoint, moving from the traditional command and control, which is really focused around power, to one where it's more about empowerment, and really encouraging local level localization and participation across the system for some of these really strong, complex challenges. So as I mentioned before, this is a little bit of an archetypal shift. We focus a lot in emergency management on the crisis management side, and this is about civil defense, so command and control, but not as much on the risk management and resilience building side. It's very difficult to turn the dial. And so there is an opportunity to transfer knowledge from crisis management to really support the risk management resilient building side of the emergency management cycle. And this is really where there's opportunities to really enhance civil protection and looking at how we can support opportunities for collaboration and empowerment to drive stability within the system. And so this is the growing edge of where emergency management is kind of, is really evolving at a global level when they talk about resiliency or the opportunity for the growing edge. So what this requires is the ability to bridge knowledge systems, moving from a very strong management paradigm where we organize agency for the future, really focused on forecasting and probability, to really understanding and having a deep presence of understanding, the system from a holistic standpoint, and then really tapping into and expanding how we anticipate. And so moving from the prediction or layering on from the prediction to really anticipating for emergence and bridging in strategic thinking and different forms of wisdom to really be able to generate strategic adaptive strategies that promote harmony and balance moving into the future. So it's really moving from a management and a very contingency future type of approach to one that really explores the changing landscape and plausible and possible futures and possibility to really allow for the opportunity to reconceptualize change, investment, and new innovation moving into the future. So to summarize or to end my presentation, really there's an opportunity within public safety and in defense to really introduce new capabilities for a very, very dynamic, a very complex, changing environment with lots of uncertainty. Really feature new opportunities to integrate futures and design, both from a human-centered local perspective to understanding it from a strategic systems perspective in order to ensure into the future, and then to have this anticipatory governance lens where it's always looking at what is shifting, what is changing in the environment, and how we need to be anticipatory, agile, and adaptive moving into the future. And so these conversations can take place over different waves. The first will start with more of the present, so really looking at the system and really understanding it from a holistic perspective, and looking at it from, cascading risk and vulnerability, and then moving towards a short-term perspective where we're looking at anticipatory and adaptive capabilities for potential disruption from emergence, but also the opportunities on the other side of that. And then the third one being more about transforming our models and really rethinking how we need to work differently moving into the future to ensure fit for purpose in future operating environments. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion period afterwards.
Thank you, Donna. That was a very interesting presentation. And now we would like to move over to Marek. And whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Allow me to share my screen. Hopefully that went well. So welcome everyone. I'm very, very happy and very honored to be here at such a prestigious event with a project that I think is amazing in the speed at which it is developing. So we are here after pretty much just over a year and a half of project work. And this is a practical project. So what we're working on, called the Digital Triage Assistant, is actually something that is literally, materializing in front of our eyes. And that is what I personally find extremely exciting about this. And we've come from basically just a whiteboard drawing a year and a half ago to now having a real prototype and talking about, field testing next year in the Czech Republic if COVID permits that. So that is all very exciting. And the Digital Triage Assistant, as it's kind of implied by the name, is an assistant system to sort and classify casualties on the battlefield. And we gave it a subtitle of transatlantic collaboration because over the past year and a half, we've grown immensely. We almost have this startup mentality, which is quite unusual for a military research project. And we have people involved from, now almost 4 universities: Johns Hopkins in the US, Czech Technical University in the Czech Republic, which is my alma mater as well, even though I'm currently present at the University of Cambridge. And then we have the University of Defense in the Czech Republic with, of course, the Czech Army being heavily involved. And we have the DefSec Innovation Hub consulting us and helping us with many issues. For example, this very conference. Great. So first of all, just to give you an idea of why we are here and what we're trying to solve, as I'm sure you're all a bit aware, the battlefield is shifting. It's changed quite a lot in the past decades. So what we're seeing less and less is the picture on the left. So a traditional battlefield where you have, 2 or more conventional forces facing each other in a relatively remote and contained location. And unfortunately, what we're seeing more and more is the image on the right. You have some call it hybrid warfare, but essentially the engagements are moving closer and closer to, population centers, to civilians. So what is getting more and more common are civilian casualties and mass casualties. And this is a big stress on the current triage systems that are put in place in the military. And it's really showing the cracks of these systems because they are really more suited to the more traditional situations that you see on the left. And we thought about this and, how can we improve this? How can we adapt to the new realities of modern warfare? And we came up with something that you might be familiar with from the maybe sci-fi movies or video games. So it's not a revolutionary concept to have that you would have an augmented reality almost, an overview of the battlefield with the combatants classified according to their triage status, and the medic that is involved in the engagement could be assisted by the system to classify who needs care the most, and what kind of care they need, etc., etc. So this would be all done in real time, and this might seem like sci-fi, but we started to think about what would actually need to be done in order to make this a reality, and that's what we're doing. So what this actually needs is actually a plethora of things. So this is a picture provided to us by the Israel Defense Forces. So that only shows that, you know, there's multiple actors, multiple militaries in the world that are thinking about this, and that's great. So we need to combine a lot of actually complex areas of expertise to make this work well and efficiently, and make this work practically for the military. So you have fields like cybersecurity, system architecture, power management, of course the considerations of human factors, algorithms, and wearables, and all this is basically contained into an integrated wearable system that we are developing, the digital triage assistant. In comparison to the more traditional triage processes that you might be familiar with, which are quite linear, just processing the information that is at hand, crunching the numbers, putting it to the next stage as if in a funnel, since we kind of acknowledge that the modern battlefield is dynamic and ever changing, we also took this approach to designing the digital triage assistant. So, of course, we collect the soldier's health data as the primary data points prior to an injury, so that is all being done live. Then we calculate the MLS, the mortality likelihood score. And of course, then we take this feed and we give it to the active medic, active in the situation, to guide them onto who to treat first, where they are, what kind of problems they might be having, etc. Then furthermore, we are informing stakeholders. So we actually take the same kind of information, perhaps enhanced by new information from the medic, and we take it up to the chain of command and up to the highest medical professionals. And perhaps what is most unique about the DTA is that we want to use machine learning and AI essentially to record social outcomes and use them to improve prediction accuracy. So our system will be able to adapt to different environments, but also learn from the data that it's getting and the outcomes that it's getting to be more and more precise in the future, which of course is quite exciting as well. So we have kind of 3 stages of the triaging capability that we're developing. The first one is pretty much already done, which I'm very happy to say. So that's the digitization of existing triage algorithms. So what this means is that we use exclusively use the live data from the point of injury, and we classify it according to algorithms that already exist, that are already there, which have, for example, absolute cutoffs, such as the breathing rates, etc. And then the algorithms classify the casualty as, let's say, red, yellow, or green. The second stage is that we are going to implement linear or polynomial regression with a data set that we have at hand. So this is in progress right now. So currently we are only performing univariate analysis, so one parameter as a time. But based on this kind of information, which we can already output an individual's MLS. And thirdly, we would like to, as I mentioned before, kind of do the artificial intelligence triage with the data sets. And we want to use real data sets that we will have gathered ourselves, because often when you have data sets coming from academia, it tends to be too clean. Whereas if we want our approach to be functional in the real world, it will never be perfectly clean. It will have to adapt to new situations. So we need to have raw data from real combat situations, and I'll get to that later. So let's talk about the minimum viable product. So we have two kind of modes that we have in mind for our product or for our device. So first is an offline product without any network. So that would be, it could be a watch, but it's a device that has its own batteries, microcomputer that is low power so that it doesn't give away the soldier's position by some radiations, for example, and a simple display attached to the gear surface. And this is important because already this kind of information can give information to the medic or what kind of treatment this particular casualty needs. And of course, based on the combat situation, there can be different, kinds of backlight settings so that it doesn't shine in during the night, etc. So we have special requirements such as no network has to be needed. It has to be very lightweight. It basically has to have a minimal chance to expose the soldier's position, but also be durable and also flexible to use. The second type of minimum viable product that we're thinking about is, or the second type of operation for the device is that we use a data network. So now for military operations, it might not be great to use GSM, and we will have to use our own kind of network implementation. But the GSM might be useful, for example, in civilian operation where the military is assisting, such as some accidents or etc. So in that case, the medic can see the display directly, which is the functionality I've already discussed. But also we can see there can be a command center that is overviewing everything on a map, and there we have more requirements. So, for example, the soldier's security still comes first. We cannot reveal their position, for example, and we also have to bear in mind that the network can be of very low quality. And this is where I would like to show you a demonstration of the project. So I would like to stress this is not a GIF, this is not a video recording, this is a simulation. So we're simulating the individual devices on a server of the Czech Technical University. So it's pretty much as real as it can get at this stage. And we have 3 cars with 3 soldiers each running or driving in some sort of a situation in the Czech Republic. So they are running across a path, and at some point they are going to be engaged. So the first car gets, the first vehicle gets assaulted, and the driver will be wounded. So the MLS gets updated, changed, and you can see the overview of the soldiers on the left. So the soldier called Bravo has been impacted by the situation, to say the least. And there's another soldier that drags them out of the car and stays with them. We can also manipulate the visualization, so we can change the status of the type of the map. So we can, for example, have satellite view. And as you can see, the soldiers are changing their position to engage the enemy or take care of the situation. More soldiers might be getting wounded. As you can see, their status is changing. And so we have another wounded soldier, and then later on, the soldiers regroup, go back to their vehicles, evacuate the situation. So this is pretty much where we are at right now. As you can see already, this is a very solid minimum viable product on the back end side that we can work with. What we want to implement more further is to implement some sort of grouping or hierarchy, so it's much easier to orient yourself in the situation where you might have more than just 9 soldiers, you might have hundreds, but the basic functionality is already there, which is the most exciting and the most important thing for me. So to kind of get to the conclusion part, we also have the our sight sets upon the first wearable options. So we have an existing tech, some existing tech mapped out. So one possibility is a commercial device like a smartwatch, a Garmin Tactics one. So that could be used. Or another one, which we are testing right now, thanks to the Faculty of Biomedical Engineering at CTU in Prague, is a device called FlexiGuard, which is very, very durable. So that's excellent, and that could be attached to the soldier. Of course, there might be questions about how to fit it with a bulletproof vest, etc., etc. So hopefully we can get funding for further development of such prototypes, but that is one of the next steps. And so that's the next immediate step, is to integrate wearables into the command center backend that I've shown you on the video. Then we want to develop the initial MLS computational model and implement the additional functionality in the command center that I mentioned before. And finally, next year, hopefully, we can go field testing with the devices to record real data that we want to try on with the Czech military. And to conclude, I'm very happy to be part of this team. We have at least 10 people on each side of the Atlantic, from Johns Hopkins University, Czech Technical University, and of course, some consultants for the defense part. So we have DefSec Innovation Hub and the general staff of the Czech Armed Forces and the University of Defense. So it's been very exciting, very fast moving, and producing real results. So I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to present this project to you, and I'll be even more happy to answer any of your questions.
Fantastic. Those were really three really interesting presentations, very different topics from what we talked about earlier today, and an interesting conversation amongst the three of them, actually, where the first one, AI dangerous, last one, AI great, and in the middle one, we really need to rethink about everything. And so it's kind of an interesting combination and of papers that kind of do speak to each other. And so I've got a couple questions, but also if the participants have questions for each other as you were engaged in this conversation, please, shoot. And I guess for Sarah, I guess the question is, can you actually ever have an ethical AI in the loop for shooting? Because it seems to me the discrimination problem is impossible, because the adversary, if it knows that it's in an AI battle space, will do its best to try to not be a signature, not to have the attributes. So flood the zone with women, or use people who are relatively short so they look like kids, or use child soldiers if you really want to go that far. So I'm curious as to the possibilities, because it seems like the distinction problem is impossible.
Yeah, I mean, some of the issues that you point out to already happen. The military age male identifier refers to also minors, or it includes minors. So age 16 and up, and in practice, children have been targeted because it is very difficult to determine age using the drone through a drone monitor. And from interviews that I conducted with individuals who are involved in counterinsurgency, I asked them, how can you tell if someone is of appropriate age? And I didn't include this in the presentation, though perhaps I had, but I was multiple individuals ended up saying something along the same theme, which is that if they're in the battle space, the assumption is that they're old enough. And part of that comes back from this sort of, this bad anthropology that uses cultural stereotypes about Muslim majority cultures. One commander told a drone pilot that in their culture, if you are of age, if you reach, the age of majority, you leave the private sphere, the sphere of women and children, and then you go out to the public. And that's where you join the men. Now, of course, apart from the fact that this is not an accurate depiction of a very diverse collection of countries and communities in a you know, location known as the Middle East or Central Asia. But it's also, I mean, even if it was, that's irrelevant. International humanitarian law does not care what if you know, 14 is old enough, as you know, according to one subgrouping. You know, there are very strict interpretations of who counts as a combatant. I am not sure whether we can reach a point where we can integrate AI into targeting. And part of that has to do with the fact that though there is a lot of emphasis on civilian protection from liberal democratic countries, in practice, civilian protection is, I mean, there's the trade-off between civilian protection and troop protection. These are like the old conversations that occur even outside of the sphere of AI. But when it comes to actually validating who is a civilian, a number of the people I interviewed said, well, you know, we don't trust local sources, so we don't include local sources when it comes to counting who died, who didn't die, and whether or not they were actually a combatant. You know, there are just, you know, additional issues involving, you know, if we are going to become more accurate in terms of identifying who is and is not a civilian, are we ready to abandon terms like the military age identifier or the military age male, which has been around since Vietnam and really is born out of counterinsurgency between well-resourced states and a smaller, less resourced, generally former colony. Right. I mean, that's the reason why we have these identifiers, is because insurgents don't identify through, you know, either verbally or or by uniform. Right. So I am not particularly confident in the use of AI within targeting specifically. Not saying that there's no role of AI in the military generally, but within targeting, I am skeptical, though, of course, if I'd be the first person to say, yes, let's use AI if it could be demonstrably shown that it would reduce civilian death.
Okay, thank you. Donna, I found your presentation really interesting because, you know, again, you're trying to get people out of their comfort zone and trying to see the world very, very differently. And I guess you know, maybe I'm impacted by the first panel, but my first response to your new metaphor was kind of gendered. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering about the trade-off of, okay, I understand that society currently is male dominated, and that's led to certain ways of thinking about, okay, the crisis warrior. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if thinking about you know, making it, you know, flipping that on its head and referring to caretakers, nurturers is problematic, and I'm curious as to how you reflected upon that trade-off or those choices.
That's a very good question. So the use of the archetype, so the shifting, so the warrior archetype in the current model, the current paradigm, and then a transformed one where it was really, the caregiving archetype was really looking at it from some of the narratives that we're using around harmony, stability, bringing in sustainability. And so when you look at that, when you look at those narratives and that story of what we want to achieve moving into the future, it's not typically associated with a warrior archetypal pattern. Mm-hmm. It's a different type of archetypal pattern. And so it is a kind of a new conversation. And so I've seen some additional literature, globally that talk about, the feminist paradigm in emergency and disaster management and what that looks like. And it's more holistic, it's more collaborative, it's more inclusive. And so I think there's an opportunity about harmony between both sides of the emergency management cycle. Crisis response holds a very masculine role just by nature of being, the identity being paramilitary and ex-military, and just the nature of the type of activities. But when you look at in terms of what we want to achieve long term, harmony, sustainability, those are very different values and principles moving into the future. And so we need to think about what are those new, mindsets, skill sets, and what type of archetype. And so an archetypal pattern was just one way to kind of showcase the difference between the two paradigms. But I think there's definitely an opportunity to continue that conversation moving into the future. And again, to find the balance between the two. And that's really the idea behind the emergency management cycle, is that there should be a balance on both sides where we're able to take what we've learned during crisis management, those understanding of where the vulnerabilities are in the system, and to be able to transfer that knowledge in a way that really looks at the system long-term in terms of healing it and moving towards sustainability and resiliency. And being willing to change culture and structures as needed to be more inclusive, more participatory, and empowering across the system.
Mm-hmm. I guess one thing that stands out for your approach versus the other two today is I can understand why politicians would pay attention to theirs. Obviously, a technology that allows you to do a better job of saving lives would be very popular, and criticisms of a technology that harms lives would be very, might get some political heat behind it. How do you propose to get cities, provinces, countries to change their approach? I believe you lead a consultant organization, right? So, what's the pitch you make to get politicians to try to change the way they think about things?
Yeah, it's really focused on anticipatory and adaptive leadership capabilities. So it's really understanding the changing environment and how we need to adjust and adapt accordingly. Because most of the time, what's happening is we're using data based on the past. And we're very much in a forecasting type of mindset. But it is a mindset shift, though. It's not easy. This is not an easy shift to make, because we're asking, organizations to expand the way they anticipate and the way they understand the future, and not just to look at it from a predictive way, because it's helpful, but it's a limited way of understanding system complexity. But understanding from an emergence perspective and opportunities. So not just disruption, but opportunities for change and innovation. And so innovation is a very big driver of a lot of work in strategic foresight and anticipatory thinking, is how do we innovate? How do we adapt, knowing that we're in a changing environment? But it's still, it's a mindset shift and a skill set shift that is slow. And there might need to be more pressure in the system to innovate before we'll see a lot more of design and foresight and futures methodologies being used more broadly.
I guess it's just to push it one step further down the road. It seems to me that politicians don't get rewarded for preventing things. They get rewarded for, I guess, responses afterwards. And I mean, there are all kinds of preventative steps we've seen the past year. In fact, every month we see a new opportunity to prevent things. So the thing I've been screaming about, the past month has been that 3 weeks ago, wastewater indicators in Ottawa were going up. And so you would think that would be a time to react and start to shut things down. But politicians don't want to do that. The consistent pattern of the past year has been to act slowly to close things down and act quickly to open things up. And so I wonder about whether we can get politicians to actually understand that resilience might be politically beneficial to themselves.
I hope so. I really hope so. I know there's some really great work done globally, with especially the 100 Resilient City Initiative, where they really try to embed a lot of futures and foresight thinking to really think about what they want to achieve moving into the future, and really thinking about where they need to innovate, which part of the system is vulnerable, and where they need to invest in order to innovate. Hopeful that, moving forward, that there is this appetite to look at resiliency more than just bouncing back, but it's how do we move forward, adapt, and transform, recognizing that we're in a changing environment. you know, the challenge that you've mentioned, because it's very difficult, because when times are good, you know, it's hard to be motivated to take on these big transformational projects because everything's fine. And then when crisis hits, you're so focused on the issues at present, you don't have time to think about anything outside of that. So it's, where do we find the space and how do we position it within that, you know, the political space to say, no, this is something we need to think about, and it's moving beyond just, you know, managing, you know, just crisis, but thinking about it long term, and how can we build that? And perhaps it will take a few more crises. It might take a lot more, you know, people mobilizing to say, you know, we're not able to recover. We're experiencing significant, you know, vulnerabilities and inequalities. And it might be that type of narrative that might open up the dialogue.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Marek, I found your presentation really amazing. The video was a terrific illustration, and the technology is just, you know, you refer to it as being, you know, science fiction. And it's exactly what we've been thinking about, is, you know, wearable things that will allow us to know when people are being harmed. So it's like, wow, we're in the 21st century. This is great. And I guess for me, the big question is I think you guys considered it, but there's so many opportunities for this technology to help the adversary. I can't help but think about, you know, there were the news stories about soldiers who were, you know, exercising, and so their Fitbit was telling the adversary exactly where their bases were. And I guess for you guys, I mean, I can't imagine any military would be thrilled about the leakage of information from this stuff. So do you see a lot more support for a non-network version of this? And, you know, can the network version only be really used for like civilians, like firefighters, or you know, disaster, you know, to go to Donna's issue area, disaster relief? And this makes complete sense for disaster relief. But if you're on a battlefield someplace else, I don't know what has been the response from the military and various militaries about this.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that we're considering, and perhaps a point that I should have stressed a little bit more during the presentation. But this is exactly the reason why we're doing the two kind of modes of operation for the device. Mm-hmm. We do, or the feedback that we've gotten is that, you know, there is value in the first mode as well, because that's much easier to get right. And if you have a medic and they have this quick information without, you know, having to process all the usual stuff about the casualty, that already helps. That already cuts down the processing time and gets the medic to actually like help faster and save more lives. So that's very important. The network on mode is highly dependent on the type of situation that the soldier kind of finds themselves in. We don't, so based on our experience, like the information, unlike let's say with Fitbit and Strava, when they I believe they kind of uncovered some secret locations, etc., this would usually be used in combat situations, right? So the value of the actual information transmitted would be quite time sensitive, and of course the type of technology really affects the level of detection that this type of communication might actually be prone to, right? So we are working with the technology that is, you know, low bandwidth, low power, wide area. So hopefully, you know, with the right type of situation determination, this type of thing can be used in a combat situation as well, especially if you're considering, you know, combat against insurgents, as you've been mentioning.
I guess the big problem, of course, is the human beings, which is always a problem with AI, as Sarah's presentation suggested. and with them requiring them to wear it, I guess you have to build in cool apps or other features so that way the soldiers actually keep the device attached to them, because a lot of them might say, well, the likelihood of me getting wounded are low, I'll just put this in my backpack because I don't want to jangle it in my wrist. It doesn't look cool, it doesn't feel comfortable. I mean, we got people, right now not wearing masks or not getting vaccines to fight the science. So I can imagine that soldiers will go, what, I'm not gonna be the one that gets hit, and if I'm gonna hit, I'm gonna be dead anyway, so why should I care? So have you figured out ways to get it around the humans who might not really want to wear it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is very far off in the project timeline, right? So we first want to have something real that is working, and then think about like, oh, how do we actually get that to the end user, right? It's like a little bit like the vaccine. You first have to know that the vaccine works, and then you can think about like how to convince people to actually take it, well, even though that's also a very important problem. But we are in discussions with the Czech army, and we've gotten excellent feedback, constructive feedback on how to integrate this into the standards, the standard soldier's uniform. It cannot be very heavy. Even a couple of grams that makes a lot of difference when you're marching for a long time. It also has to be soft so that you can go under the bulletproof vests, etc., etc. So there are basically two ways of going around this. One you've already hinted, so give it some features that so the soldiers actually want to use it, in which case it would be kind of tough in the sense that every soldier is in a way unique, and they might expect different features to motivate them to actually use it. And the approach that we're kind of getting right now is to make it as little of a nuisance as it can possibly be, and just integrate it into the standard, or make it very easily integratable into the standard uniform, so that it's almost seamless. And as a soldier, you just don't even notice it necessarily. If you're a medic, you can look for it, you can use it very easily, but as a soldier, you don't even think about having that stuff on you.
Thank you very much. Sarah, when we think about the use of AI, obviously there's been a lot of criticism about this. Maybe, I guess again, when we get back to conventional warfare, maybe that it makes more sense in those areas, or maybe when we're dealing in the future with swarms of drones, that might be a way that AI technology might make sense. So if we can separate out different kinds of battlefields, that maybe the AI can stick around as a targeting agent, even if when things get messy, we need to turn it off.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, the narrative, there has been a bit of a narrative shift, specifically, I mean, in Canada too, but I mean, my focus is mostly on the US, because they're really the driving technological force behind AI adoption in military environments. Post 9/11, of course, you see this huge incursion of ISR technologies, and the reason why you have investment into drones has to do with irregular warfare and the urban environment. And now, of course, we're back to near peer competition, and China looms large in AI ethics discussions. So now AI is seen as a feature within state to state or conventional warfare. I mean, this all goes back to, I feel a bit silly even saying this, but the revolution in military affairs and the idea that we're going to be developing the system of systems. And this is, the promise of technological innovation since honestly before the Cold War even. And I mean, the Canadian government, for example, in strong, strong, secure, engaged, the D&D, the official publication still explicitly references the system of systems approach. So I think there is a, dare I say, ideological drive behind technological adoption, regardless of adversary. There's always going to be a reason why more tech is a good idea. Now, I think, with sort of laser guided munitions and technology, it's hard to say that more technology hasn't in some way been beneficial. whether it's in ballistic defense or what have you. My primary research area is in irregular war, simply because that has been the most, that is the character of most wars that we end up fighting, even if it's not always the emphasis in publication, journal publications, or in the news. That's generally the character of war. It's in some way defined by its irregularity against, generally insurgent and counterinsurgent environments. I haven't really investigated the targeting cycle as it comes, as it relates to China and Russia, because those are usually the two big baddies that are referenced when we're talking about AI in conventional battle. And I'm not going to, I think I'm more interested, because the issue I'm looking at is algorithmic discrimination. I generally have, my research emphasis has been on urban environments where it is already difficult to distinguish civilians from combatants. I think that's the concern, not necessarily combatants versus combatants, where the moral character of that war, I think, is a little less concerning to the average person, perhaps. So I can't say I've done too much research on AI as it relates to peer-to-peer competition yet. Only that, I've definitely noticed a bit of a narrative shift in the last few years. So I wish I could answer your question with a bit more data, but I don't necessarily want to speculate without having access to the numbers. Part of this is all future proofing. I mean, we're not really at a point where we can say any degree of autonomy truly exists in our weapon systems. Also, it's a bit complicated to even say what counts as autonomy, because there is no consensus definition on when a piece of technology is truly autonomous, right? But yeah, I've so far been looking at ISR in as it relates to more to less well-resourced organized political violence.
Well, I think the consistency that you probably see is that the democracies of the world like to avoid the political costs of war, and they like to invest in technology because that's a way, spending money is not as costly as spending lives. And so we prefer technological solutions to our problems. I mean, in your conversations about insurgent conflicts, getting intelligence is difficult. The easy choice is to rely on technology. If we can spend more money on technology rather than spending money on trying to learn what's going on in Afghanistan, then let's just build the better drones and rely on war through technology. That is the American way of warfare, and our allies are in. Well, Canada has joined in on that. And so that's going to be an enduring problem, because AI seems to be convenient, but it as you discussed, it's garbage in, garbage out. It's really hard. I mean, if we can't get all kinds of medical things in North America to work, or scanners to work, but because they can't take pictures or identify people of color, then I can't imagine how they can discriminate, between combatants and non-combatants in places like Afghanistan, unless they can find, they take pictures of guns,
Yeah, and I mean, I think too, in a place like Afghanistan, where gun ownership is, is one of the highest in the world, and is used for non-combatant purposes, gun ownership is not generally a sufficient measure for determining whether someone is a combatant or not. I mean, some villages, for example, are heavily armed because they're trying to defend against the Taliban. In that sense, they seem more like natural allies than anything else, right? And yeah, I mean, I would also, I think there is a perception, certainly, that AI will reduce the human footprint in war. And certainly one of the appeals with drones or any kind of remote system is that you do remove your own soldiers from the battlefield and you increase troop protection. And it's probably not helped that, programs like, for example, the Human Terrain System had, to say it lightly, very mixed results in terms of the human intelligence that was collected, which probably creates more of a drive towards AI adoption as well. But, when you think about who's actually required to pilot a drone, right? Like a Reaper or I guess the Predator is sort of defunct now, but like if you think about, drones that don't even have a missile attached to the body of the frame, these are huge, extensive crews, often rely on private military contractors as well. So is the war footprint, the human footprint, actually being decreased, or is it just becoming invisible? And in that sense, you actually are able to create to create the environment for not just persistent data collection, but persistent war outside of public condemnation in many cases, because you don't see the body bags, right? You don't see the troops on the ground. You don't have, CNN embedding journalists in Afghanistan trying to get these really newsworthy visual shots, right? So, I would actually probably argue that I would just push back, I think, against the idea that AI also reduces the footprint. And is it easier? I think a lot of developers are, who are honest or, willing to, let's just say the people that tend to hate computers the most seem to be the ones responsible for their design, personal experience there. So I don't know if it's easier for the software developers, but maybe for policymakers who are trying to avoid political costs, certainly it could be very appealing.
Well, I could talk to each of you for hours about each of your topics because they're fascinating, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your expertise and your research with us. I want to thank all of the folks who have participated in today's capstone, including Ozan and Stella, introducing everybody, the earlier panelists, Marek, Donna, and Sarah in their presentations, and the partners who nominated them. Again, as I said earlier to the other crew, I really wish we could have hung out in person. I really wish we could have had dinner on me. We'll try to do that at some point. Once we can do that all, in the future. And before I wrap up, and I want to thank Stephanie Plant and Melissa Jennings for doing all the organizing of the event. I want to thank again Shuker for funding this event. And I want to thank our students who've done a lot of work to make this possible. And I want to highlight that we will have the tape of this online, or tape. See, I'm obsolete. We'll have the recording of this up probably by the end of the week, early next week on YouTube. So look for the Canadian Defense and Security Network on YouTube, and you should be able to find this event next week if you couldn't watch the whole thing. And look for our undergraduate excellence scholarships. So we're going to be advertising soon to try to lure 2 more undergraduates into the defense and security community. And we'll also announce our website, CDSN-RCDS.com, our Twitter account, which is CDSN-RCDS, and we'll have another episode of Battle Rhythm that's dropping on Wednesday. I want to thank you guys again for great presentations. It was really very interesting. And now I've got a lot to think about in terms of the machines around me and all the metaphors that are shaping my imagination. So thank you very much, Marek, Donna, and Sarah. Have a great week.